All right, so welcome everybody. I want to say thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Elle Potter, and I am the founder and president of Yoga Buzz. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization here in town. We started doing yoga at breweries, so it's fitting that we're here having this conversation tonight. Actually, we started at Schlafly at the tap room. So maybe this is a good luck charm. My husband also worked for them, so that's helpful. But we started doing yoga at breweries, followed by a beer tasting to make yoga more accessible to people who might be intimidated to the practice. And as the past year and a couple months have gone by, it's clear that making yoga accessible is beyond just making it less intimidating. It means taking it out into the community. And so the more I think about what it means to make yoga accessible, the deeper down the rabbit hole I go. And luckily, there's other people to go on the trip with me down the rabbit hole. When I posted this event up on Facebook, when I first got these four incredible women to agree to do this, and then I posted it up on Facebook, and within 48 hours had over 300 people that had clicked interest in this conversation. I posted in there, but I really was sitting in public in tears, like just completely blown away that there were this many people in our community who are open, well, and my mom in Colorado who also RSVP'd, but who were open to learning more and starting this dialogue. And that's step one in bringing this conversation into the mainstream, both in the yoga world as well as within our city. So I'm just incredibly blown away. Thank you. So with Yoga Buzz, what's happened has been kind of unplanned. Things just kind of keep unfolding. And what is now in existence is a platform that is connecting a really engaged and interested audience, which I spend a lot of time just kind of in shock that that's happening, but I feel a responsibility to use that platform to ignite conversation that provokes meaningful change, not just through the yoga community, but through our city as well. We've been through a lot as a community, and I remember talking to a friend of mine about feeling like I should do something to help my city, and being like, and I'm a yoga teacher, so like, now what? But it just takes starting the conversation. So I first want to ask, how many of you have never been to a Yoga Buzz event before? Neat, thanks. So just to clear up any misconceptions, we don't drink while doing yoga. It's yoga before beer, you're in the clear. We also, so you should come. How many of you are yoga teachers or in teacher training right now learning to be teachers? Cool, awesome. And how many of you are social workers or in school for social work? Cool. And how many of you are healthcare professionals? Sweet, awesome. I also just want to say thank you. Oh, who are both in the yoga world and in either social work or healthcare? Nice, sweet. Bridging. I also want to say thank you to those of you who are here tonight who aren't in any of those categories, and especially acknowledge those of you who are here as a way to step into the idea of using yoga as a healing tool for yourself, whatever it is that you are growing and moving through, or if there's somebody in your life that you really want to help share this information with so that they can heal as well. So this really is just the beginning of the conversation, the beginning of taking it more mainstream, and where Yoga Buzz is moving towards is creating a community outreach program. So we have an event this Thursday at Union Station, which I've so conveniently placed a flyer in the middle of all of your tables. 100% of ticket sales for this is going towards the creation of a yoga program that will be free for St. Louis area veterans. And so Yoga Buzz has partnered up with the VA St. Louis healthcare system. And from the second that this conversation, which thanks to Carrie is really where this conversation began, so thanks to you. And thanks, Justin, for picking a good girlfriend who is doing good things in the world. But it was very clear from the beginning that if Yoga Buzz, or if anybody is taking the time to go out into the community and teach yoga, that the understanding of trauma is really clear, because no matter how well-intentioned you are or anybody is going into something, if you don't fully understand, it can potentially cause more harm than good. And that's sort of what my experience has been personally through yoga, and that's why it's very important to me to create that platform for education. And I'm not an expert, and so and some of these ladies will say that they're not either, but they have way more education and knowledge, and so that's why they're here this evening. So I want to introduce just real briefly here these talented individuals. To my immediate right is Kate Upshur, who has her own private counseling practice called Thrive Counseling. And then Charli Prather, who has her own private counseling practice as well. She also works with the Wounded Warrior Project, quarterly, and goes out and works with veterans, teaching them mindfulness-based practices. So she was the first person I reached out to about yoga at the VA. And then Dr. Sue Tebb, who is on the faculty at SLU in the School of Social Work. She is also a yoga instructor and co-chair on the International Association of Yoga Therapists. And then Lori Brockhouse, who is a yoga teacher as well as a social worker and a teacher of social work. Is that the way to say that? And she's also in charge of the Oxygen Project, which provides yoga to youth out in the community through schools and such. So I clearly, therefore, am a big fan of her work. So in order to practice what we preach through this conversation, which is mindfulness-based, just being mindful, really, Charli is going to lead us in a brief centering. So I'll pass it off to you.
Hey, all. I have a very difficult time projecting my voice these days. I'll do the best I can. If it's available to you to close your eyes, great. If not, find your drishti. Find it behind somebody's head, find it somewhere on the floor, somewhere just a few feet in front of you. And let's try to center just for a moment or two. Noticing what you're sitting on. Notice the position that your body is in. Notice the floor against your feet. Notice what is supporting you right now. What is supporting you in your work? Notice how it feels to call up your support. To be in this space with these people. Begin to imagine feeling a connection to every person in this room, to every person you've ever worked with or ever will work with, who also has a passion for walking this path united in this moment. Think about what called you to be here today. Making sure that you're willing to monotask while you're here for just these few moments. Be willing to be truly present just as you are when you're teaching, you're counseling, you're serving. Namaste.
Thanks. So, again, the intention behind this conversation this evening is to just start to scratch the surface. Before we get going, I'm going to provide you with two definitions that I think are really important before we launch into this conversation. First one being trauma-informed. So trauma-informed care is an approach to engaging people with histories of trauma that recognizes the presence of trauma symptoms and acknowledges the role that trauma has played in that person's life. So it's being aware. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've been through an in-depth training. It just means that you understand what you might be looking for or what you might experience in somebody in a relationship with somebody who has been through trauma, or what it means for you if you've been through trauma and how that plays out, right? Then, of course, trauma, the word trauma. A traumatic event can involve interpersonal events such as physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, war, community violence, neglect, maltreatment, loss of a caregiver or a loved one, natural disasters, terrorism, witnessing of violence, or experiencing trauma vicariously, but it can also result from chronic adversity, chronic severe or life-threatening injuries, illnesses, and accidents. Trauma interferes with one's ability to cope. So that's kind of just the beginning of the definitions. So the first question that I want to pose to our panelists is, why does somatic therapy work? And maybe beginning with an explanation of what somatic therapy is. Do you want to start?
Sure. So kind of to begin my answer off of the definition of trauma, part of it is also trauma overwhelms our ability to cope effectively. And so we all have heard of the fight or flight response, which is a very physical response in the body. So the body prepares to engage the systems for survival. Somatic experiencing gets at that, or somatic therapy gets at that, at the interoceptive pathways of the brain that help people pay attention to feedback coming from their body and help regulate their system that way. That's kind of a short answer to that, but it helps to it helps people to gradually reconnect to their body, which cannot feel safe if triggers are coming from within the body as well.
I think Kate did a beautiful job of talking about somatic therapy. My injection into that would be, as a therapist, an old therapist, I've been working with veterans for 22 years, and for me, talk therapy just wasn't cutting it anymore. And being able to teach veterans and teach people who'd been through disasters like Katrina and medical trauma, which isn't really spoken about very often and should be, being able to teach them to call upon their parasympathetic nervous system at will, which is that rest and digest part of the brain. When I saw that actually working, I got very excited about that and wanted to know more.
And just to add to that part, I think the important piece is why yoga, because it's the mind and body, which is what somatic therapy does. It brings that mind and body together, and yoga does that. And so that's the reason that I have selected yoga to work in this area of trauma.
I'll just speak briefly to working with youth, and typically talk therapy doesn't often work with youth because they might have had we call it complex trauma, in which it's sustained trauma. Maybe that's living in poverty, maybe that's abuse over a period of time. So sometimes it's inexplicable. In terms of being able to verbalize is challenging for youth in general. And we know that these experiences, this trauma settles into the body. So this is a way for youth, as Charli mentioned, these repetitive movements actually settle into the body and do the work much better than if we were to ask a child or an adult to describe the experiences and work through it in that way. So getting to the root of it. I think in Emerson's book, they called, I forget the whole title of it, Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga.
Through yoga, right.
Okay, it's that simple. He calls yoga a bottom up, not bottoms up. No pun intended. That too. A bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, and that we're getting kind of to the root of the issues when we're using the body.
That reminds me too, I think we often get those patterns set in our brains as sankharas, and we repeat, and talk therapy continues to help us repeat. So this is a method to bring that mind and body together outside of the talk bit, where we don't have the opportunity to repeat, but we're using our breath and our movement to begin to make new patterns in our body.
I'm supposed to keep the red side in. So you kind of started to talk about it. Any other thoughts as far as what are the benefits of using yoga to heal, or as a tool to heal trauma?
Yeah, so I would say yoga can be a good addition to help people reconnect to their bodies. The caveat I would say to that is it's important for it to be very gradual. Sue kind of touched on the possibility to rehearse and kind of go back into almost a re-traumatized state. And sometimes that's possible through yoga as well. It's possible through talking. It's also possible if people become, the body can be a source of triggers for trauma as well. So a trigger is anything that reminds a person of the traumatic event, and it can be external or internal. So yoga postures can sometimes be that trigger, depending on the person and depending on what their experience has been. So to really gradually introduce a reconnecting to the body, a lot, because people have disconnected. If they've been through chronic trauma, it's possible they've disconnected because the body no longer feels safe. So it can be very overwhelming to ask them to be in their body, essentially. So it's a gradual pace, but as they take that at their own pace, they can find a sense of choice and empowerment through that experience, and a sense of safety in their body as well. And so that helps at a very deep level rewire those connections in the brain.
And another simple technique is, when you're trying to make a connection with someone who's clearly not open to a more traditional way of opening the door, and one of the things that we do with the Wounded Warrior Project, we introduce yoga immediately so that they don't have time to think that they hate it. We're pretty much in the room together maybe an hour, and we're breathing together and doing some very simple sun salutes seated, and pretty soon they're doing yoga and they don't even know it. So it's a really sneaky way of really introducing therapy, or not just therapy, but connection to other people in a safe container.
And it helps with learning to control those thoughts, too, when you were saying that. It reminded me when you talked about throwing them in and not letting them know. One of the projects I did was I worked for the Center for Survivors of Torture and War Trauma, and the sister that was head of it didn't tell the group at all that that's what we were there for. We had no idea that she hadn't told them. So we walked in thinking they knew that they were going to be doing a yoga session along with their talk therapy, and she hadn't told them at all. But this group, because of that, stayed, and they were intent, and they were interested, and they were willing to learn and to try, because we were doing it together and working with them. And we were showing them immediately some things that they could take home with them, like how to use breath so that they could sleep better that night. And I think that's one of the benefits for me, is that breath work is so important for people. At the very beginning, because that helps connect them to something that they can take away when they leave you.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize what you mentioned about the tools, being able to take some tools with us through the yoga. And I often think of, in social work, we talk a lot about meeting the client where they are. And I think of that, apply that a lot in yoga work as well, in that we have so many practices to pull from that we can really meet the person where they are. So if we have someone who is dissociated, which means they basically kind of learn to shut down their body for protection. We do grounding techniques. We can do movements. We can do breath work that will help to ground them. So, and we can do as little or as much as someone's ready for. So I'm reminded of that as a benefit, that it can really meet us where we are. And I think we probably see that in our own practice too. We get what we need on any given day if we let ourselves.
And just to follow up on that, if you've been injured or your body's been through medical procedures that are extremely invasive, your body is no longer your friend in many cases. You feel very differently about your body that may have been strong once, and now you see in a weakened state. So teaching people that strong looks a lot of different ways as a survivor of cancer or combat trauma, or a natural disaster or an accident, reintroducing them that your body is okay where it is right now. It doesn't have to feel broken.
And I'll just add a little bit to that and what I said earlier. So part of this gradual process of introducing people to yoga is emphasizing choice. So for, different people are going to connect to different postures, and some people are not going to want anything to do with a certain posture. So giving them the element of choice to modify and to feel safe where they are can be a very empowering experience as well.
And just when one of you starts to say something that then I'm like, ooh, I want to ask about, then the next one answers the question. So I'm really, yeah, I know. It's like you guys do good work or something. Thank you. So along kind of as you started to talk about triggers and possibly yoga potentially being re-traumatizing, I think, Kate, you speaking to giving choice is very important, as well as being aware of a student or a client or a person who has a tendency to dissociate. And if any of you have ever gone to yoga because you were having a shitty day and you were just like, I just need to like check out and move around, like I have done that quite often in vinyasa practice. It's just like, oh, I'm just gonna do this yoga class and then forget that I should be breathing more deeply or whatever it might be. And so it can also be, yoga can be a tool for dissociating if you're not careful, is my point. So what are some challenges specifically within the use of the yoga practice? Any additional thoughts as far as challenges in using yoga as a tool?
How long do we have?
I was going to say where to start. Yeah, so I think a big challenge is that everyone's different. I would say one of the things that comes to mind is sometimes I think, especially with people that have been through chronic trauma, or they've been in a situation where they were held down and couldn't move, the relaxation response can actually be threatening. It can actually trigger anxiety. And so that doesn't mean we don't want to work with that parasympathetic response, but it's gradual, and it means looking for, are they uncomfortable somehow? So it might be a little bit of movement. It might be sitting in resting posture instead of lying down. So it's just a lot of choice, because if you're teaching a class, you don't know what anyone's experience is, and that could be a trauma-informed class, or that could be any yoga class. You don't know really who's in the room. So I would say that's a big challenge, and just kind of being aware of what's going on with people. Are they checking out? Are they kind of, do the eyes look kind of glassy? Or are they kind of shaking, maybe more activated? So that would be, I think, the biggest thing that comes to my mind.
Tell me the question again.
What are some challenges?
Challenges, okay, all right. Just the introduction of yoga, many times people will feel that it is something that could be against their religion. or witchcraft. We see that a lot because a lot of our military have turned to religion after their combat trauma. So it can sometimes be a really great way to educate about what yoga is and isn't. If it's a male Wounded Warrior project, it's pretty immediate that it's not a hot young yoga teacher. Sorry, guys, it's grandma, and so it's not quite what they thought it might be. And I think one of the biggest challenges the very first time I taught was really getting them to understand that farting is good and it's part of the practice, and not to be embarrassed and not to not come to yoga because they're afraid they're going to pass gas. I know that sounds really silly, it's not very scientific, but it's a barrier. I was getting feedback that people skipped the first morning because they were gassy. So that's definitely a challenge. And just the inability issue. And so I use a lot of my own stiffness, my own medical trauma, to relay my message that if I can do it, you can do it. And the very simplest, that's my dog, sorry, he hears me. The most simple movements can be healing. And it's not about moving into crow, and it's not about moving into a headstand. I wish I could do a headstand now, but I can't. But boy, when I'm looking underneath me and I see somebody like Lori or Sue or Kate move into a headstand, I'm doing that headstand in my mind. In my head, I'm in headstand. Teaching that is a beautiful thing.
For me, I think it's really important to create a safe container. And I think as social workers and healthcare professionals, that's one of the things that you do. But as a yoga teacher, you also need to be able to do that. You need to have people safe in that room. And for someone that's been traumatized, that doesn't mean locking the door. That means having the door maybe unlocked so that they can feel free to come and go. And it's not necessarily holding all those rules about not talking, not moving, not doing whatever, but being allowing them to be able to self-determine what they want to do, what they can do. So it can be maybe disruptive to you as a yoga teacher, but allow that to happen. Give them that kind of freedom where they can make the choice as to whether they want to participate or not, whether they want to close their eyes. Like Charli started today, she gave you that option to either close your eyes or not. And I think that's so important, is to be able to, as a yoga teacher, allow people to decide what they want to be able to do. And then my job is to give them all kinds of different options so that they can feel like if they can't stand on their head, they feel like they're there, right?
I think self-awareness is quite important too. I teach yoga teachers, and one thing that I emphasize is always questioning why. So oftentimes in teaching yoga, we're frustrated by something, or we don't understand something, or we question a response to something we've taught. And a lot of it is checking in with ourselves. And for example, why wouldn't they close their eyes? Why do they keep looking at me? What did I do that they keep looking at me? Well, it's not about you at all. It's about their own experiences. So I think being really self-aware and always reflective about why you're teaching, what you're teaching. And I had something else to add. Oh, with working with kids, it's a lot about, like what Kate mentioned, just having a bunch of tools in your toolkit. I'm looking at some of my kids yoga teachers back here who understand that, I've got to know some options to use when a kid farts in the class, I've got to know, because they're not going to hold it in and stay home like you. I have to know, what am I going to do if a kid doesn't want to take their socks off, or if a kid doesn't want to take their shoes off? How am I going to keep them engaged? I have to know what I'm going to do if a kid refuses to participate at all, or they want to do their own thing. So just having a lot of options at hand, and being able to be really intuitive with that. Like, what does each person need in this moment? Not necessarily, well, this is my plan for the day.
One of the other thoughts that I have too is knowing your own competency level. So no matter whether you're a healthcare professional or a yoga teacher, knowing what your own limits are and not going beyond them just because you feel that you might be able to help this person. The best help you could do is maybe make a referral. So find somebody, if you're only a yoga teacher or only a healthcare professional, partner with somebody so you make good referrals back and forth. I think that's so important to be able to do that, because we're not all good at everything. Thank you. You know, so we need to know what our limits are and live with those.
And also, I think, just piggybacking on that, knowing something that we've talked about is knowing the context that you're in. So even if you are both a yoga teacher and a mental health professional, my role in teaching a yoga class at a studio or community setting is certainly not going to be a therapy role. So understanding the context that you're in and sticking to that.
I'm glad you brought up the boundaries issue, just challenges when you're both. It is challenging. If I have someone in my class who happens to know that I'm a therapist, and then they say, oh, you know, they want to become a client, that's not clean. It doesn't feel good for me. And so I might show them some of the other classes that they may like and go to, and maybe in time when they're not interested in my class anymore, maybe that's an option. But it's never an option to troll for clients in a class, and vice versa. It just should never be done, and it's something that you have to be very careful about, because people do get drawn to you as a teacher.
Again, you hit all the points that I wanted to make sure were hit. It's amazing. I do think that one of the biggest challenges that I've seen from the outside is overstepping boundaries and not understanding if you try to have too much control over a yoga class, and that's some people's personalities. Man, I am a control kind of a freak sometimes, and there was definitely a time where my classes were very particular. It was like, do it this way and do it that way, and the entire environment I needed to feel in charge of. So that's a little insight into what I was going through at the time. And you know, and now in retrospect, when I think of the interactions that I was having in students where I felt really triggered, and then their reactions and how they were clearly feeling triggered as well, but we didn't understand each other from a psychological perspective, so yes. So what are some tips for a yoga teacher who's wanting to incorporate more trauma-informed practices into just what they're doing in general?
I would say, kind of like we've touched on, give the element of choice, and Lori said it beautifully, being self-aware and it's not you. If someone leaves the class, if they want to sit during Shavasana and not lie down, or if they have to keep their fingers moving, that speaks more to what their process is right now. You know, in getting in touch, with whatever they're going through. So I would say using self-awareness and making sure that every posture, of course, as yoga teachers, usually there's some preparation that goes into a yoga class, but just making sure there's always options. So they in Warrior 2, they may decide to move their arms, make it more of a dynamic movement. They may want to kind of go into the arm position and then bring it back out. They may want to do something lying down. And I know my yoga teacher training taught modifications. I think it's just always using language also that invites them to do a particular thing and doesn't tell them to go into a particular posture, because that's when it might be like, oh, I can't do a headstand. What do I do now? And I cannot do a headstand either. So I've kind of right, yeah. So just using language that invites them to be to use their options. That one option's not better than the other. It doesn't mean that you're more advanced if you take, or less advanced if you take an option. And using language that helps them tune into their direct experience. Notice what is that like? What is this experience like? Language that helps them contact their direct experience in the moment is what I would say.
Now, language is very important. You may want to try to things like inviting people to do things, really paying attention to triggers, and also knowing that you will trigger someone. Just plan on it. You will. It will happen. Not everyone abreacts that's been through trauma. Indeed, it is not the norm that someone will have, some sort of an abreaction because they've been traumatized. It will probably be something subtle, but avoiding certain types of language. I called it to an attention of a teacher that I truly loved, that when this particular teacher used your body melting into the mat triggered me. I've been working with war trauma for 22 years. I've heard things, and I couldn't go to the class anymore because that was something that was part of the repertoire of the teacher every time. And I felt like I needed to call it to the teacher's attention, just as that's something they might want to be aware of. These fans many times will trigger. Those can be a trigger. Even the color of the walls from a chemotherapy room can trigger. Words that, pubic bone, things like that, eye sockets, just being very aware of the language that you're using. For my work, I'm not allowed to use any Sanskrit at all because WWP is a post 9/11 program, so that is a genre of war where Middle Eastern music and Sanskrit terms are could be triggers. Now, with that being said, my son is a 9-time deployer of Afghanistan. He's seen a lot. He's been injured. He is not triggered by Sanskrit. So I've had just as many warriors say, where's the groovy music? Why aren't we getting groovy music? As I have warriors that I'm sure would have been triggered immediately by Dave Stringer, who, I love to use in a civilian class. So being very important, the music is very important, messaging in music, beats in music, all of that. Just, it's, there's a whole workshop around why those things are important.
I think touch, too, is something that we need to think about. So always, if you are going to touch, ask for permission, and give it in ways where people don't call attention to themselves necessarily. So Lori and I were looking at this very expensive deck of some kind of cards that cost, I don't know, $30, $40.
The flip chips.
The flip chips, right. And we decided that you could just get a deck of cards really cheap and you could use them on mat. So think about something where it doesn't call people's attention to the fact that they don't want to be touched, but always give that choice. Or maybe you just make the decision that you're not going to touch at all. Or if you do touch, you invite them to move into you as opposed to you touching and moving into them.
I want to give a little bit more detail on that. I think as yoga teachers, we're often taught explicitly or implicitly that to be a good yoga teacher, you're the one walking around the room and giving these really deep adjustments and putting people in places they haven't been before. I've been asked by some yoga trainees, well, how many times, because I'm a big advocate of getting permission for touch and using it quite conservatively, people have asked, how many people have you seen injured as a result of touch? In my 10 years of teaching, I've had 2 students tell me that they were injured by a yoga teacher. And that's enough for me to be really, really careful and teach other people to be really, really careful in terms of using touch. So I think in addition to what Sue mentioned in always getting permission for exactly what you're going to do. Is it okay if I touch your shoulder now? And also letting people know that they always have a way out. So you might say at the beginning of your class, there might be times that I will come around and ask if it's okay to touch. Please know that you can say no at any point. If it doesn't feel good after it happens, please say no. And that's a really good lesson for people that have felt kind of a loss of control over their bodies. The other thing I want to mention is letting people know that sometimes we have pretty strong reactions in yoga. So for me, it's going into pigeon pose. I can cry like that on certain days. And so if we believe that we hold trauma, we hold stuck emotion and experiences in different parts of the body, sometimes that comes out in a yoga class, and people can get very afraid of that. So I think normalizing those things, so saying something like, sometimes when people do this extreme hip opening pose, emotions come up. Sometimes anger comes up, sadness comes up. So that can just make people feel a little bit more comfortable having those experiences.
And we often use guided imagery in our meditations. So when you were saying melt into the mat kind of thing, we have to be really cautious about in meditation, and when we take people into it or into Shavasana, when you lead them in, sometimes we talk a lot as we move people into that period of time, to think about the imagery that we use so that we're very aware or sensitive to choosing things that won't bring up or won't trigger people.
And again, you may be using non-triggering language and non-triggering music, and guess what? You triggered someone. And if that happens, there are lots of really lovely things that you can do. If someone's in Shavasana, laying a blanket across them, to feel that heaviness. I watched someone in a Bethesda tutorial, a Bethesda, Maryland tutorial, walk over to someone in a wheelchair and just, she asked prior to, hold your hand up if you'd like for me to hold your hand right now, knowing that this person was being triggered. And she just held his hand. I mean, it was the most beautiful moment. Another thing is to call not attention to the person, but attention to the feeling, by saying sometimes, just like Laurie said. And also saying little things like, we've got your back in here. We're all together in this. You have all the resources that you need in this room to get through this moment right now. That will hopefully keep someone from bolting out of the room, which happens also.
I would just add, I like what you said about that you will trigger someone. One of the most helpful things they said in the trauma-sensitive yoga training I did at Kripalu was, yoga is part of a world where triggers happen. So people are already being triggered just by anything, and you don't know what that will be. It is helpful to to remember that it may show up for people in different ways. So they may dissociate, or kind of checking out. And if they do, if you're seeing kind of like glassy eyes, kind of doing something maybe that invites a little bit more movement, or it may be more of a kind of a activation, kind of shaking. So maybe doing something that calls their attention to their breath, or is more of a grounding invitation. So, yeah.
I would just add that in addition to all of that remembering that as a yoga teacher you have tools that you can offer, but it doesn't mean that you can fix somebody. So when you see somebody triggered, or when you see something and you don't understand, don't feel that you have to fix it. Don't feel that you have to then spend 20 minutes after class talking to that person or holding their hand or walking them through an exercise. Understand what your boundaries are as well, and when and listening to what they're saying, but not necessarily giving as much as you're receiving in the conversation. I think that that's a really important thing.